I've done it for just you might notice I've added a little bit to my titles. Again, it's an open question which I'm moving pretty fast. But many of you have put me in a great position with that because you talk very helpfully about things that I can now talk about more quickly. This is already the end of the day, I'm looking forward to very much more. I would, like many of you, like to start by thanking the organizers and as in particular for his papers. But I can't do that because of a traumatic experience I had yesterday at the Einstein Museum here in Bern, which I recommend highly. It's very clean. When I sat down to the explanation of Einstein's theory of special relativity, there's the museum, approved, I can only assume, by local experts. I faced this slide, which was harder to read than I hoped. But what it says, 300,000 can't be the same as 375. That's true. It says, how we get to Einstein's judgment theory, there's only one solution to the problem. There's only one thing it could be. And I thought my life's work has been for nothing. And so but otherwise, I'm having a wonderful year, and I'm sure it's going to keep getting better. All right, so here's where we're headed. Okay. What I'm going to argue is that for a long time, essentially the length of modern realism debate, realists and anti-realists both have sought to identify what I'm going to call general criteria of epistemic security. What those criteria would do would pick out claims or aspects of our best scientific theories that we can be confident will be preserved in their successors. Recognized and ratified indefinitely in the future. I'm going to argue that we already have enough evidence to call this audit as a failure. That general criteria, the kind that realism is looking for, are not forthcoming and will not be forthcoming. But I'm going to suggest we should no less strongly reject the competing particularist view. What's involved in particularism has now come up as an interesting topic in its own right. But the kind of particularism I'm going to talk about, I think we should reject. And that is the view that historical or philosophical investigations of science simply add nothing at all to scientists' own efforts to determine what the truth is about nature. Right? That's, I think, the central particularist method. And I'll say why that is, but here's where I'm really headed. Right? I think just famous, classic, extant investigations of the historical record and interpret philosophical interpretations of that history offer important epistemic lessons for scientists themselves, and for any of us who wish to proportion our confidence in particular scientific beliefs to the full range of relevant evidence for those beliefs. But we can only get there if we stop seeing these historical investigations that people have gone into simply as failed attempts to identify general criteria of epistemic security. Right? We will have to look again at the things, the historical work that's been done, and emulated to do the difficult work of learning the contextual, fallible, uncertain, and complex epistemic guidance that will realistically be forthcoming from the history and philosophy of science for the practice of science itself. I think we've been, without even stopping to think about it, we've adopted an implausible view of what it is that philosophical inquiry can do for the first order epistemic project of finding out what the world is like. And I'll try to suggest what I think we should be doing. instead. Okay, so we'll start with general criteria of epistemic security. Here, again, I'm going to move pretty fast. As I said, it's from Boyd and Loudon and Putnam and everybody. Most philosophers, I would suggest, on both sides of the ongoing debate concerning realism, have been firmly in the business of trying to identify general criteria of epistemic security. That is to say, right, in the original version, what characteristics does the scientific theory need to have? Not the predictive success, maturity, or something. What characteristic of a theory reliably indicates that it will probably be retained and ratified throughout the remaining course of scientific inquiry? That was the original form. Historical pressure led to the recognition that even the most successful scientific theories of the past have been repeated and subsequently abandoned or radically transformed. And that's led defenders of scientific realism to seek increasingly stringent criteria of epistemic security that would have, if we've been using them, restricted past commitments to just all and only those scientific beliefs that have turned out to be ratified, turned out to be retained by further. And so that's this down here, right? The selective realist version of this, which is asking which elements or claims or aspects of a sufficiently successful scientific theory will probably be retained and ratified throughout the remaining courses of scientific inquiry. And people who have made this move to selective realism have given us a bewildering array of options, including many very famous ones defended by people in this room and maybe virtually in this room. Oh, I'm afraid my bad. Yeah, here's because they haven't complained yet, so I don't see the problem. But actually, you want me to wear that look?
I haven't. I haven't received it.
I've just explained why I'm right about everything. And yes. Here. Audience online, this is my viewer up against me. Okay. Bunch of different claims, right? Most are now familiar, right? So we've got more claim, oh, it's the structural claims, and we've got pictures claim, oh, it's the working posits. We've got Scotland's claim, or causal descriptions or something. We can have this kind of confidence. After I've reviewed our correspondence after the Pitt Fellows meeting, I think still feel very good about putting you up here. With a special concern for detection properties, obviously I'm lumping things here too, but it's up here too. Similar special concern. Maybe those are the things, right? Those are the kinds of things that if you have a sufficiently successful theory, that's what's going to hold on from it. And most recently, I'd say a claim of this 95% consensus among scientists. Maybe that's maybe that's what takes out the claims that are going to hold up. And the last year, I found out this morning, this is no longer a defense of selective realism. Its author is giving up the ghost on being a realist, and so I want to be caught up. But I had been thinking about this one. Okay, so very similar, right? Each of these criteria of epistemic security seeks to limit realist commitments to just the things, right? Just the parts or features or aspects of past scientific theories that we would have been right to expect, defined, retained, and ratified throughout the course of further investigation. Right? Selective realism saying these are the things in our contemporary theories we should expect to continue to be ratified. Okay, so far no surprises, but it turns out, right, the realists, instrumentalists, or anti-realist opponents have also firmly been in the business of proposing and defending general criteria of epistemic security. It's just the criteria that they favor are far too weak to satisfy the realists. Right? So, for example, the canonical misreading of von Frossen holds that observability is the special epistemic line, right? Where we can have belief for that and remain agnostic about the rest. quickly, the reason that's a misreading is that von Frost's position is not motivated by the idea that this is a bright epistemic, doesn't matter brightness. This is an epistemically significant line. The way that constructive empiricism is built in a lab to have the implication that, well, think of it this way. What von Frost's really doing, saying, how little can we get away with believing while we use all science to the full extent, right? That's what the motivation is for the dividing line of observability. It's not that there's something extra specially epistemically risky about that, right? Okay, no, I'm not saying that. That's why it's a misreading. But nonetheless, the canonical misreading says, this is where the risk arises, and so where we need to worry, we need to restrict our beliefs to just beliefs about observable things, right? It's no less a general criterion of epistemic security. Same kind of thing, right? So to be clear, right? In one sense, this von Frosten view is completely opposed to the scientific realist, right? The scientific realist says we should believe at least the fundamentals of what contemporary theories tell us about atoms or dark matter or the end of the universe, right? Well, he says we shouldn't, or at least that we need not. But for all that, beliefs about observables is no less a proposed general criterion distinguishing trustworthy from untrustworthy scientific beliefs. That is the suggestion that we can safely extend our creeds to claims about structure or composites or any particular thing. Same thing is true for protocol sentences, empirical predictions, or recipes for intervention, right? Or any of these standard maneuvers, right? The categories or kinds of claims that even scientific anti-realists and instrumentalists tended to regard as secure. In fact, realists have sometimes criticized their opponents for failing to propose or endorse any such general criteria, right? And that's still picture. Sorry, no, it's not. This is in reference to Philip Kitcher, criticizing their a long time ago. Okay, so what I'm going to do is argue first, the evidence already gleaned from our investigations of the historical record should lead us to abandon the search for general criteria of epistemic security. We already have enough evidence to make a convincing case for the claim that successful general criteria of epistemic security are not going to be forthcoming. But as I said, particularists, the people who have most forcefully made the claim against that kind of generality, I think are no less mistaken. I think they're just as mistaken to further insist, right, in addition to getting out of the general criteria of epistemic security business, to insist that there's simply nothing of genuine epistemic value for science to be learned from its historical or philosophical investigations. I'm ultimately going to suggest there's actually a great deal of valuable epistemic guidance that can be learned from the history and philosophy of science for scientists and indeed for any of us who hope to proportion our beliefs to the full range of available relevant evidence for them. But it won't surprise you to learn the form that this valuable epistemic guidance is going to take. It's not going to be general criterion of epistemic security. Okay, so let's try to get there. So one kind of welcome consequence of realist views being presented with difficult, challenging examples from the history of science has been to bring influential forms of scientific realism and anti-realism closer to each other than they've ever been before. Somebody that earlier was kindly mentioned that I said this elsewhere and have. In fact, I've suggested that there are a number of really foundational commitments that most contemporary realists and at least their opponents who are motivated by the historical record share. Right? But won't worry about most of them, but the one that really matters for today is this last. This is actually quite far the most one, right? Something I call the Matty Wilson principle. The Matty Wilson principle holds that when a Scientific theory enjoys a track record of fine-grained and wide-ranging success in guiding our practical engagement with the world. It typically does so in virtue of some systematic connection between the description of the world offered by that theory and how things actually stand in the world itself. Let me pause for a second and say that I firmly believe that the vast majority of self-identified scientific realists who are not part of this discussion with us, this is all that they mean by scientific theory. It's this, and also sort of a pro attitude about science, where you saying science is lame, science is great, right? And I'm pro science, not anti-science. But what they're really committed to, right, is just this, right? That there really is a systematic, complicated relationship between the story that our theory tells about how the world is and how it really is. And it's in virtue of that complicated relationship that the theory succeeds as well as it does. But that is not a view that an historicist critic of scientific realism should feel any need to disagree with. To see why, right, why this thing that grounds most of the self-proclaimed realists' realism, right, just it isn't what divides the camps, at least not anymore. So let me see if I can illustrate that. Okay, let's see why the historicist instrumentalist shouldn't be troubled by that suggestion at all. In fact, enthusiastically endorse it, right? Start this way. Suppose that Einstein's relativistic mechanics represents a true and complete account of how things stand in the otherwise inaccessible domain of nature that it describes. On that assumption, we can explain the spectacular success of Newton's gravitational mechanics by describing in detail how aspects or elements of Newton's mechanics, gravitational forces, stand in systematic relationships to features of the actual world as described by special and general relativity, and how those systematic relationships look like that permit the theoretical apparatus of Newtonian mechanics to successfully guide predictions and interventions across a wide, though not unlimited range of circumstances. If we think that contemporary orthodoxy in mechanics simply describes how things really stand in nature, then the details of these systematic relationships would themselves constitute the reasons why Newtonian mechanics works as well as it does. Assuming the truth of contemporary theoretical orthodoxy more generally, we would similarly be able to explain, right? Would similarly allow us to identify the actual reasons for the impressive instrumental utility of many other successful but ultimately rejected scientific theories of the past. You know, all the examples I'm talking about. Ether and then. But it's all those classic examples. But here's the thing. Even if we think that all contemporary scientific theories are fundamentally mistaken, we should nonetheless believe that that highly successful theories stand in one or more systematic relationships to the truth of the matter regarding various inaccessible parts of nature that are like the relationship between Newton and relativistic mechanics, or like that between caloric theory and contemporary thermodynamics, or like that between phlogiston theory and contemporary theory, and so on, right? It's complicated relationships like that, right? But if that's all that's going on, oh yeah, there's a complicated relationship in virtue of which the thing enjoys the success that it does. We haven't made a case for realism at that point, right? If all you're insisting on is some complicated connection, right? The Maddie Wilson principle denies what some philosophers have asserted, which is that you can't ask that question, or there's no explanation for it or anything like that. But the historicist isn't, nothing in the historicist's evidence base motivates them to think that, right? What they think is, what we have now is going to turn out to be like what we had before, and what we're gonna, right? We're gonna believe, oh yeah, when we look back, there's a systematic, complicated relationship of this kind, right? But we should fully believe in a systematic, complicated relationship of that kind in virtue of which it's successful or is successful, whether we've got the truth now or not, right? That's all that the naturalistic school requires. Okay. That. The problem is, even this small collection of examples we just talked about, right? The systematic relationship between Newtonian mechanics and relativistic mechanics, and caloric theory and thermodynamics, and the rest, right? That even that little collection of very familiar examples illustrates that there's no such relationship holding between all or most earlier successful theories and their contemporary successors, right? Realists would need to appeal to a wide and heterogeneous array of different systematic relationships or reasons of this sort in order to explain the diverse particular empirical successes of the many instrumentally powerful past scientific theories that were subsequently abandoned or rejected, right? So the details turn out to be very different across even this limited space of examples, right? That cuts against the idea that there's a single systematic relationship we can impute or safely infer when we've got a successful theory. It turns what this historical evidence seems to suggest is that the theories that we've had, the complicated connections to contemporary theories in virtue of which people think they've been successful, turn out to be radically heterogeneous from one another. Right? It's not the same relationship. So this notable heterogeneity in the systematic relationships we found to hold between various successful theories that have been subsequently abandoned and claims of contemporary scientific orthodoxy has made things increasingly uncomfortable for those who seek to defend the selected forms of scientific realism that we described earlier. Each newly proposed version of selective scientific realism seems to be generated from a suggestive, motivating example or two in which some particular element or aspect or feature of the rejected scientific theory really was preserved in its successors. But none of the associated criteria of epistemic security seems to successfully generalize. Sometimes it's a rejected theory's past claims about the structure of nature of the certain. Sometimes instead it's a theory's working posits, or the core causal descriptions of those posits, or something else altogether. While no single candidate seems to capture more than just one or two cases of such theoretical preservation for which it was developed, while simply gesturing hopefully at the rest. In this way, the motivating examples for each distinctive form of selective realism serve as counterexamples to all of the other versions, because those versions are in pursuit of a general criterion of epistemic security, right? And so they're undermining each other. They're also undermining the claim that there's any single aspect or feature or part of a successful scientific theory that will be reliably preserved in its successors. In fact, if there's any general lesson that emerges from these historical explorations, it would seem to be that contexts of scientific theorizing, evidence, and confirmation are simply too heterogeneous and pluralistic and complex for any general criterion of this level of abstraction to reliably pick out just those beliefs and commitments highly likely to be retained and ratified throughout future inquiry. Right? These are too abstract. These are two abstract concepts to use in trying to formulate an epistemic criterion will actually be smart. Okay, so we think of what we've what the historical evidence is showing us in that way, right? We can see the recent history in the realism debate is sort of a continuing collapse of serially proposed abstract and general criteria of epistemic security under pressure from the historical record. And that has led some realist philosophers of science to suggest that the search for any such general criterion was itself profoundly misguided all along. So Yuha Satsi has recently argued, right, that it's a manifestation of philosophical arrogance to think that as a realist philosopher, one commits oneself to providing a global recipe, largely independently of the science steeped in relevant details, for revealing what aspects of theory-role correspondence makes any given theory in mature science. Okay, I can't predict what's going to be. That would be absurd without knowing a lot about the individual evidence, right? I'm not sure. I think Satsi is only committed to the Wilson principle, as opposed to the classical realist project of being able to tell us, right, what items of knowledge are secure and what they are. But in any case, right, this is sort of where we got from trying to develop as general criteria of epistemic security all these competing forms of semantic realism. Of course, there's an influential minority tradition reaching at least as far back as Arthur Fine's defense of the natural and classical attitude in Noah, that it long held that this search for such general criteria is a fool's errand. So Fine suggests that the delicate and painstaking scientific work of evaluating particular claims in scientific contexts already represents our most sophisticated collective efforts to determine the appropriate level of confidence we should have in particular cases concerning claims about what entities exist and what claims about them are true. If the fine, humble, and quotidian, philosophically unanalyzed senses of things like truth exist, right? So what he says is, right, the general lesson is that in the context of science, adopting an attitude of belief has as warrant precisely that which science itself grants. Nothing more, but certainly nothing less. What scientists are doing is already our best effort, our most sensitive to the details that occur in the context that we're talking about, effort to figure out what's true and how confident we should be in various beliefs about the world. And we're not adding anything to that when we come in with our big theories about undetermination, historical record, or what have you. Similar particularist sentiments are expressed by my colleague Penelope Maddy, who faults both realists and anti-realists for passing over the details of the evidence for each particular problem, shirking the responsibility to evaluate each case individually. So these are the kind of the original anti-general criteria of epistemic security people, right? And they are advocating a kind of particulars, right? So we also see particular sentiments of this same kind expressed famously by P.D. Magnus and Craig Callender, right? Who tells that profitable realism debates must abandon wholesale arguments seeking to settle realism debates en masse in favor of retail arguments that resolve questions only about particular kinds or individuals. Now, if the accumulating historical evidence convinces us that no successful general criteria of epistemic security are forthcoming, would this show that particularists like Fine, Maddy, and Magnus and Callender were right all along? No, it would not. And I think that largely because such particularists are also keen to insist that the historical and philosophical reflection on scientific inquiry simply has nothing useful to add to the considerations that scientists already take up and consider when they try to determine the various degrees of confidence we should have in particular claims of evidence. That is to say, such particularists are highly skeptical that there is any useful epistemic guidance for science itself to be found at any level of abstraction or generality higher than that of the individual scientific case or investigation. And here is where I think that particularism is found. So Fine and Maddy both leave room for the bare logical possibility of finding useful epistemic guidance, not top down, the way that the general criteria kind of thing that said, maybe it's not, oh no, that didn't work, it's not just, that's what else could be, right? But bottom up by starting with particular cases and working up them, they raise that possibility, getting that guidance by abstracting away or generalizing over individual cases, only to abuse its plausibility in both cases, to suggest that instead science itself already contains all of the epistemic resources that we actually need. Fine. Yeah, okay. Fine suggests that this reflects an unwarranted essentialism about science. Maddie suggests that any such generalities we will uncover will simply stand inert and require modification when they inevitably wind up conflicting with confirmational judgments. That's the question about the normativity of the rules. And no, these particulars really mean it, right? That the particular judgment is what has the normative authority. Okay, Magnus and Callender are, if anything, even more skeptical of obtaining useful epistemic guidance for science by generalizing from particular cases in that kind of bottom-up fashion. They concede that it might be logically possible to try to get epistemic guidance by generalizing over cases. They say, reflecting on the vast complexities of various historical episodes in science, there's no reason to think that the general assumptions one finds would be at all simple, natural, or even non-disjunctive. No guarantee that the criterion one finds will be either interesting or useful. We should pay attention to particular cases for their own sake and not as proxies for something else. Right? The great hope of realism and anti-realism lies in the detail that attend to the details of particular cases. Okay, so I'm now going to suggest that although those particularists are quite right to reject the search for general criteria of epistemics, they're quite wrong to think that historical philosophical reflection concerning scientific inquiry therefore has little or nothing to contribute to our efforts to determine the credibility of particular scientific beliefs. More specifically, right, I'm going to suggest there's a whole lot of epistemically hard-won guidance for science to be found at levels of abstraction and generality higher than those that scientists themselves characteristically employ in deciding what the credences they assign to particular claims. In fact, already existing historical and intellectual reflections on scientific inquiry already have a lot of guidance kind of encoded in them to offer scientists and any of us who would try to proportion their scientific confidence to the evidence. It's just that guidance does not take and should not aspire to take the form of any criterion security. Let me see if I can show you what I've got in mind. We'll start with a really simple example that I that I draw in that fossils paper that Peter was kind enough to mention. Right? Here's the epistemic moral of that paper. It is that we should be least confident in the truth of our scientific beliefs when the evidence that we have in support of those beliefs is exclusively abductive or limited in character, where inference to the best explanation is all we've got. That's the form of all the evidence we have that will make such good sense out of the things we observe. That's what's gotten us into trouble repeatedly in the past. Excuse me. And so I'm worried about, I think we should be maximally concerned in cases where that's the only kind of evidence we have in other times. Now notice that suggestion doesn't even attempt to provide a general criterion of epistemic security. It doesn't identify a property having non-abductive evidence that purports to distinguish scientific beliefs that will never be overturned from those that will or still might. It's instead a piece of hard-won practical epistemic wisdom and guidance that it seems should just influence the credences of anyone who's trying to proportion the confidence with which they hold a particular scientific belief to the full range of evidence that's relevant to that belief, including the fact that it relies only on limited or abductive evidence, right? So the full range of evidence that's relevant to deciding the right degree of confidence to hold, which to hold, which is scientific claim, is evidence found in the historical record of scientific inquiry itself. That sort of consideration should simply not sweep in and replace, but simply combine with other evidential considerations in determining the level of confidence appropriate for any particular scientific claim. When we recognize the claim as exclusively abductive experimental or observational supporting evidence, that should lower the confidence we would otherwise be inclined to assign to it on the basis of that experimental and observational evidence alone, like what we learned from history of science. But this is also not the sort of epistemic moral that's easily recognized by an individual scientist pursuing particular scientific investigations. Although it is a lesson that should impact the frequency that scientists and any of us, right, assign to particular beliefs. It's one that clearly emerges only at a level of abstraction and generality higher than that at which scientists themselves tend to operate, and in response to historical evidence of a sort that's usually neglected in particular scientific investigation. In short, it's the sort of epistemic moral more easily discovered by philosophical and historical inquiry than by scientists seeking to answer a particular question, solve a particular problem, or test a particular hypothesis. And I think there are many more such lessons offered by history and philosophy of science, if only we can get ourselves out of the general criteria of epistemic security business long enough to appreciate them, right? Or well enough to appreciate them. So a more complicated example comes from Kitcher's influential discussion of the 19th century wave theory of light and electromagnetism. Following a thoughtful and detailed analysis of how and why this theory enjoyed a wide range of dramatic empirical successes, Kitcher suggests that the case offers a general epistemic lesson. It's the working posits of a successful theory you should expect to remain parts of our scientific nature. What time did I start? All right. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Coming back. It's the working posits, right? Everybody knows the story. We should expect working posits of successful theories to be preserved and maintained, but we shouldn't expect that for theories idle or merely presuppositional posits. In this case, the relevant idle or presuppositional posit was the optical and electromagnetic ether, through which the waves of light and electromagnetism were presumed to propagate. In response to Loudon's invocation of J.C. Maxwell's famous claim that the ether was better confirmed than any other entity in natural philosophy, Kitcher suggests that Maxwell was completely wrong, because 18th century wave theorists of light should have recognized that the ether did no work in generating the theory's predictions. It was instead something they simply presupposed must exist in order for wave light transmission to be possible at all. He goes on to say that the moral of Loudon's story is not that theoretical positives in general is untrustworthy, but that presuppositional positives are such that. And from the analysis, he goes on to derive a general criterion of epistemic security, right? The success of a theory provides grounds for thinking that the hypotheses that characterize working posits are approximately true. Okay. So the actual criterion of idleness that Kitcher provides won't work, but we're going to ignore those details because there's a very natural way to reconstruct the idea of a presuppositional or hypothesis that we can use instead. And that is the idea that working posits are those to which a theory assigns some direct causal role in the production of phenomena, right? Like atoms and genes, where idle and presuppositional posits, like the ether, have no such direct causal role, but nonetheless seem to be required in order for those more direct causal explanations of particular phenomena to be true, or, as in the case of the ether itself, perhaps even just for them to be judged coherent or intelligible. Right? Now, Maxwell thought it was literal nonsense to think that it's talked about wave transmission without me. Can't do this. Not really. So this charitably revised version of footnotes, right? Even this charitably revised version of Kitcher's criterion fails miserably as a criterion, as a general criterion of epistemic security. For one thing, very few theories have at least easily recognizable presuppositional posits, so this distinction can't be employed in a fully general way to try to distinguish secure scientific beliefs from others. But even more importantly, many posits that are unambiguously working posits, either by Kitcher's original formulation of the criterion or the alternative I just suggested to you, have indeed been abandoned throughout the history of scientific inquiry. Posits like the phlogiston and colloid fluid and hereditary gemmules and the germplasm really were assigned direct causal roles in the production of phenomena. They were nonetheless subsequently abandoned along with other theories of posits. It's simply not true that we can broadly trust the working posits of even highly successful scientific theories to be retained and ratified by their successors. So it fails, Kitcher's proposal here fails spectacularly as a general criterion of epistemic security. Right? But I want to suggest it nonetheless offers some hard-won practical epistemic wisdom for scientists and the rest of us, right? That we are missing if we do what at least the realism debate was doing for a while, which is saying, hey, maybe it's a working positive. No, it's not a working positive. It's not the structure, right? It was general criteria of epistemic security or bust, right? You're either finding that or you fail. Right? I think it's the wrong way to think about the historical work that's already being done in realism. Okay. What this historical work suggests is that whenever we can identify a particular positive or successful theory as merely presuppositional in the way that the ether seems to be, right, we just described, we should be more skeptical about it and the theory's central claims about it than we are concerning the working posits or claims about the working posits of that same successful theory. Again, this doesn't give us a means to pick out scientific beliefs that can be trusted to persist in some recognizable form throughout the course of inquiry, right? We already noted that being a working posit is no proof against being abandoned in the course of further investigation. Nor can we conclude that we should be more confident in the existence of any working posit in any successful theory than we are in any presuppositional posit of a different successful theory. But the cautionary tale of the ether nonetheless makes it reasonable to suppose that whenever we ourselves recognize that a particular posit of a scientific theory does not cause phenomena directly, but is nonetheless simply seems required for the intelligibility or coherence or success of our empirical predictions and explanations, that recognition should reduce our confidence in the existence of that posit and or our theory's central claims about it, particularly in relation to other claims of the theory, but also that case would just become stronger as we found further examples of successful passive scientific theories whose working posits were retained when their presuppositional posits were abandoned, right? But you don't go do that if you just toss what you said, no, wait, we got to look at these things that didn't work there, we're done, right? Then you don't go keep building the stronger case for what is it we really learn about presuppositional posits, right? Rather than throwing them away when, as soon as they turn out not to be successful general criteria. Okay, most importantly, this case, I think, clearly illustrates the way in which philosophers of science really can make substantial contributions to determining the appropriate credences to assign to our scientific beliefs in light of the widest range of relevant evidence, while simply dispensing with the search for general criteria of economic security altogether. Kitcher is wrong to conclude, as a general matter, that the success of the theory provides grounds for thinking that the hypotheses that characterize working posits are approximately true. But he's quite right, or at least plausibly right, to suggest, right, that presuppositional posits are suspect, or at least more suspect than the corresponding working counterparts in a given theory. And that guidance really should lead us to assign credences to scientific beliefs differently than we would if we instead follow the particularists in dismissing evidence from history of science or its philosophical analysis as irrelevant or unimportant to scientific inquiry itself. Right? Particularist says, get out of the way. You're not helping. Right? You're not doing anything. The ladder you think you're climbing is laying flat. Right? That's where I think they've gone wrong. That's not so. There's plenty to be learned that really should impact our credences about scientific claims and beliefs that we learn not in the course of what scientists themselves, the evidence that scientists themselves pay close attention to, and at levels of abstraction and generality higher than that of the individual scientific investigation. Okay. Where we may also do the oral structure nature example, hydrogen. People know a lot about this. We want to talk about this structural realism example or? Yeah. But look, you know how the story goes, right? There's no univocal sense of structure that can do all the jobs that structural realists needed to do. Right? But there's none but four, it fails miserably as a criterion, general criterion of epistemic security, just exactly the same way, right? But there's still substantialism in the idea that when we can identify parts or elements of the theory as structural in something like the sense of, the Fresnel to Maxwell equation continuity, if we can identify things that are plausibly structural, like those, like that, then that really should impact the theory, right? We should expect, especially comparatively, we should expect those parts or elements or claims of scientific theory to be on that we should put them on firmer conformational ground than other parts of the very same theory. Okay, that's that. Good. It doesn't matter which of Laurel's ways of thinking about it, right? That's the bottom line, right? What it's going to do again, right? It's the sort of epistemic guidance we will get out of this, or the Kitcher example, or the possible example, or lots of other examples we can talk about, right? Is not the sort of thing we were looking for. It's not second order evidence that sweeps in and settles what we should believe by dispensing with or setting aside what we think of as the first order. These are first order evidential considerations about what we should believe. It's just that the evidence is being drawn from a different pool, right? But this is not where. No. I'm going to be resisting for the next bit here the idea that that a good way to think about the realism debate and what we ought to be doing within it lies in this, which we've heard described a couple of ways already today, this idea that there's a separate philosophical job that where we sweep in and we're going to say what we should really believe about nature, right? In light of special things we know as philosophers because of our special philosophical belief or something like that. That two level picture, I'll say a few words about it in a second, but I want to be pushed against that. The kind of epistemic guidance we can get from the history and philosophy of science for the scientific enterprise itself is first order. There are evidential considerations right there on the ground with the experimental results, right? And all of those evidential considerations are relevant to determining the level of credence we should assign to a particular belief or how confident we should be that it will be preserved as science goes in the future. Okay, that's enough. That. All right. So here are a few preliminary conclusions before I talk about the Pleasian act of philosophy. Won't surprise you. Philosophers of science should indeed get out of the general criteria of epistemic security business altogether, joining those of us who resisted getting in all along. That's one. Two. Not for particularists, that doesn't mean there's no useful or interesting epistemic guidance for science to be found at levels of abstraction or generality above that of the individual scientific investigation. That's just a prejudice. It's not true. We can plot out a bunch of historical work that's already been done and understand it as giving us not a master criterion that's going to come down to whether we haven't about 3%. Well, now I know what to believe, right? For first order evidential consideration, it's going to have to combine with them very often with others and unpleasantly not sweeping in and solving all the problems. How they scientists switch to the new way. Okay. We do need to revise our picture of the sort of epistemic guidance we expect to gain, that it's realistic to gain, the thing we can get from philosophical and historical reflections. When we do, I think we're going to find that we still have lots of useful epistemic guidance for science to learn. In the sort of careful, thoughtful, illuminating inquiries that scholars all across this board have achieved. What people have been already doing so successfully, accepting it and framing it as part of a search for general criteria. And I think in doing that, we're simply leaving the more succulent and delicious fruits of that inquiry on the table. Okay. I said this a long time. I was right all along. Let's do this. Okay, here at the meta level, that was my meta level reflection so far about scientific realism debate. We're going to close with a meta reflection to adopt the view that I just suggested, how we ought to think about it, the kind of epistemic guidance, kind of first orders that history and philosophy of science can and should provide. I think is to advocate a return to a much more integrated and unified activity that we might think of as the kind of thing that natural philosophers do. Right? So let's see. So once upon a time, there were no scientists. As everybody here knows, that time was before 1833, when people coined the term scientist to refer to the single institutional identity emerging in modern research university. But before that, right, what we call science was done by people who thought of themselves as natural philosophers and natural historians too. But more specifically, right, philosophy was just a systematic, organized study of things, and natural philosophy was a systematic, organized study of the natural world. And so philosophy of science, to the extent that it was done at all, was done by the same people who were doing the science, right? Really, the debate didn't start with Plato, right? People like Matt and Poincaré who were bringing in consideration for the philosophy of science. Try to understand what our credences should be in various of scientific claims, right? And of course, right, the institutional identity of science took on its own thing, got enormous, right? So successful in schools, so every kind of stuff like going on a modern research university campus, and you'd find way more science than anything else. The two activities, right, philosophical interest in science and its practice of science, became so separated that a group of philosophers could reinvent the philosophy of science, essentially, right? In the third century, there should be a philosophy of science, right? But remember, that philosophy of science that was invented had unapologetically normative ambitions, right? And this is connected to the kind of identity crisis that I think philosophy of science is going through right now. It has been for a little while, right? We had right. Rudolph and Ernst and Otto, they swept in to make the world safe for science, right? To tell people when they weren't doing real science that their stuff was religion or metaphysics, even, right? So we could tell people when they're doing science and when they're doing it right, and when their explanations really have the proper logical form of the right. It was unapologetically telling scientists when they're getting it right. A conception of the philosophy of science that you might cartoonify as the epistemic police, right? That's how it started. And of course, we've become ever so much more sophisticated in that. What that enterprise ran into was what somebody earlier said, the radical heterogeneity and plurality and complexity of scientific context, right? This is a bit ridiculous to kind of wow, how dumb to think that you could sweep in and with a few, with clever arguments, settle the questions that scientists themselves are trying to settle in such painstaking ways. To be fair to the fountainhead there, for them it was because we have predicate logic now. Right? And so that's also the answer. What are philosophers going to do in this new world where science is really the important thing? We'll be the people who are talking about the logical things, right? And so, for example, theorizing that explanation, who's trying to find the right logical form of explanations, right? Because logic was the hammer that we had to do things with. And so, as the normative pretensions of classical philosophy of science ran into complexity and heterogeneity over and over again. Philosophy of science itself became much more epistemically humble, to the point where now these days, it's not at all uncommon to find people who ever dream of telling scientists how to do science. That's a silly thing to think we could do. We want to understand science, right? We want to, in all its complex heterogeneous, full-flowered beauty, right? We just want to explore. But this approach, right, runs the risk of turning us into the anthropologists of science, where we're just saying how science is, right? That's the opposite risk of the unapologetically normative thing. Is that we're more like stamp collectors, right? Say, oh, hey, wait, guys, I found a new set of explanations over here. Well, these ones are brown, right? And we're just cataloging the thing, trying to describe it in ways that make more evident how science is able to do, how scientists are able to do the wonderful things that they do, doing it just fine on their own. Okay. I'm not going to, I've written elsewhere, but I'm not going to suggest how to resolve this tension in the most attractive way. But what I do want to point out here is that notice the original realism debate, right, was rebooted in this normative context, right? The idea was, the most fundamental idea for the realists was, hey, we can have an argument for scientific realism that's at least as good as what scientists themselves have. But what the force of that was supposed to be was to sweep in and settle what people should believe, right? Whether we should believe in the existence of atoms or not, on the basis of these kinds of arguments, okay? And so that's how the realism dispute got rebooted, as a search for these kinds of criteria that could do that work, right? Criteria that could separate the things we really ought to believe in from the things that we don't have adequate justification for believing. And to some extent, we were victimized, philosophers of science were victimized by the allure of clever arguments, right? If you were anything like me, as a much younger person, you saw an argument like the ultimate argument, the no miracles argument, the pessimist deduction, said, well, that's interesting. I wonder if it's right. Without ever stopping to think, is it realistic to think that through something like an argument like this, you could do the work that science does, determining degrees of the appropriate degrees of confidence in particular empirical claims? If I stopped to ask that question, I think my answer would have been no, right? But I was too, it was too tempting, too delicious to grasp onto these clever second order arguments and try to decide what we thought about them. We started fighting about them, but it was fun. It just went, right? So here's where I'm headed with this stuff. Okay. The realism debate, I think, is not just another issue in the philosophy of science. It's not just another question about science that philosophers might find interesting. Many do find interesting. What it is, and the reason is, it has an intimate connection, right? It has a real role to play in the first order project of natural philosophy, right? In the first order project, deciding what our credences in particular scientific beliefs should be. So we need a non-imperialist kind of normativity that we're willing to assert, right? The people say, "I'm really never going to tell us. You're talking about your position if you're telling scientists you should use them." No, right? Part of what I've been claiming is that natural philosophers don't sweep in with a second order argument to tell scientists what to believe, right? But we're finding first order evidence that it would be a mistake. You'd be doing it wrong, right? You would be ignoring evidence that is relevant to your claim in assigning credences to scientific claims or beliefs. And that kind of normativity we still need to hang on to, even as we're getting so much more appropriately modest about telling scientists what science is, and modest about what a complex task it's even going to be to understand them. So this is part of why I'm saying realism isn't just another question about science that some philosophers happen to find interesting. So part of why I'm advocating this particular picture of what the sort of right thing to do here is at this stage of realism debate is that I care very much about our contributions to this first order project, figuring out what to believe, right? And the sort of natural philosophy I've been describing here makes substantive, essential, unapologetically normative contributions to first order scientific debates about what to believe. It's a part of those debates, right? In the way that science is and always was natural philosophy, right? There are these institutional historical reasons that these things got separated. We sort of started over with a different kind of philosophy coming at science, right? But the part of philosophy of science that is itself part of the scientific enterprise, right? That's something different and special, different from just questions that philosophers happen to find interesting about science. And it's something that I'm worried about losing in this sort of slide over to, well, of course we would be telling scientists how to do science. That's crazy. No, I don't think that's right. The more descriptive and respectful and epistemically humble attitude towards things like complexity and heterogeneity, absolutely, right? But I firmly think sometimes we should be telling scientists how to do science. We say, hey, look, all your evidence there is adductive, right? Or hey, wait, this isn't really playing a direct causal role, right? This is just presupposed, so the other thing makes sense, whatever, right? It's not the sweep in from above constructive empiricism, Freudian realism, or anything like that. But it is itself. The claim is these are evidential considerations. We would be making a mistake to ignore if what we want to do is identify those